Hey guys, Richard Holder here. Got a 5-liter Coyote slugging it out with a bunch of LS motors. We got a modified 4.8, we got a modified 5.3, and we got a modified 6-liter. Can any of these LS motors take down the Coyote? In this video, we're going to take a look at a modified 5-liter Coyote. That's right, a Gen 1 Coyote, stock bottom end with ported heads, cams, and intake manifold. So how much power do you think it'll make? More importantly, how does that modified Coyote compare to a 4.8-liter LS with heads, cam, and intake manifold, or the larger 5.3-liter with heads, cam, and intake manifold, or a 6-liter with, you guessed it, heads, cam, and intake manifold? Can any of these LS motors match the Coyote? It's time to get started on a comparison between the 5-liter Ford Coyote engine and most of the LS family, including a 4.8, a 5.3, and a 6.0. And as we will see, even though the Coyote is only at 5 liters, it actually takes a modified 6-liter LS to equal the power output, the power potential of our modified Coyote. And in all cases, we ran these combinations starting with the Coyote, basically heads, cam, and intake using the stock bottom end. And that's very important because that means we're limited in available cam timing, both on the Coyote and all of the LS combinations. So we're limited in how much camshaft we can run because we only have basically stock pistons without deep valve reliefs that don't allow us to run lots of camshaft. And it's the same thing in the Coyote. Ford Racing supplied this Coyote crate motor way back in 2010, at the end of 2010, when they were introducing the Coyotes as a 2011 model year. We ran this Coyote crate motor. I did a ton of testing with it. We ran blowers on it and turbos and nitrous and headers and intake manifolds and all kinds of stuff. What I'm going to show you here is our combinations where we use ported heads, camshafts, and a couple of different intake manifolds, obviously along with long tube headers, and I'll show you what the headers do as well. But we're going to compare that then to modified versions of the 4.8, 5.3, and 6-liter. So here is our stock Coyote motor, crate motor, run with stock exhaust manifolds and 2.5-inch exhaust. It had an electric water pump, but it did have the factory air intake and mass air assembly. We ran it with a controls pack from Ford Racing, run in stock trim with an optimized tune. This combination, the factory Coyote, produced 448 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 405 foot-pounds of torque. So here's what happened. We normally run, like with all of the LS stuff, sometimes I run the stock exhaust manifolds, but usually we run long tube headers. So here's what happened when we added headers to our Coyote motor. The power output jumped to 461 horsepower, and peak torque was up a little bit to 411 foot-pounds, and it picked up a lot down low. So here's what happened when we ran the headers on it. But let's take a look and see what happens when we really step things up. So we'll go over to a combination where we ran this same short block, but with ported heads, CNC ported heads, and comp NSR camshaft. So here is the power output of our combination with heads and cam on it, and I'll go ahead and get the specs on that. The comp cams featured a 492/453 lift split and a 228/231 degree duration split. As I said, the heads were CNC ported, and this was run with the factory intake manifold, the factory long runner intake manifold. But with the heads and camshaft, and obviously the long tube header still, this combination produced 545 horsepower. And peak torque was up to 474 foot-pounds of torque. But we had one more combination that we ran on this thing and allowed it to produce at least the highest peak power. And that was when we added the Boss intake manifold. So the Boss intake manifold, kind of typical of short runner stuff. This thing produced 471 horsepower, but out at 7,400 RPM. And it probably would have kept going had we revved it a little bit farther than that. And 449 foot-pounds of torque. So you can see in the green, the torque was down from the long runner manifold, which we would suspect. I mean, that's definitely the combination. When you go to shorter runner lengths, you pick up power up top, but it always trades power down low. So the peak torque went from 474 foot-pounds down to 449 foot-pounds of torque. But here is our modified heads, cam, and intake Coyote. 571 horsepower and 449 foot-pounds of torque. Let's see how it compares to the motors in the LS family. So the 4.8 liter LS is probably the closest in displacement of the factory motors to the 5 liter Coyote, but really they're not marketplace competitors because a 4.8 liter was used as a base motor for a lot of the truck applications, and the 5 liter, although they did use that also in the truck, we're not comparing a truck version, we're comparing a Mustang version, which is much more performance oriented, but we'll take a look and see how it compares to a stock and modified version. Now this is kind of my go-to combination for the 4.8 because it ended up making the most power. This is the most powerful 4.8 on heads, cam, and intake that I've ever run and tested. So it's kind of my go-to piece, but run in stock trim. This was an LR4, 4.8 liter from the wrecking yard. It had stock head, basically stock everything. Stock intake manifold, throttle body. We did run it with long tube headers, no accessories the way that we always do with an optimized tune, and equipped with all of the stock components. It might have had an aftermarket throttle body on it, a manual throttle body, but it was the same size as a factory throttle body. This thing produced 333 horsepower all the way out at 5,400 RPM. And 343 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened after we modified it with heads, cam, and intake manifold. And that was with a total engine airflow, stage 2 ported 706 heads, a Crane 590, 224, 232 at 115 camshaft, and a fast LSX-RT intake manifold. We used the same headers. And here's what happened to the power output. It jumped up quite a bit. The combination obviously picked up power from the heads, cam, and intake manifold, 476 horsepower and 392 foot-pounds of torque. So it was doing very well. And there's probably more. We could fit a slightly bigger camshaft in this. We could go up another 7 degrees or so of intake duration, and we could probably tighten up the LSA, which I would like to do on a 4.8. You could probably make a little more power than this, but this is kind of typical of what a guy would put together for a heads, cam, and intake. Let's see how this compares to when we ran our Coyote here. So this is just with the ported heads and the stock intake manifold on the Coyote in the green. It made 545 versus 475 for the 4.8. And as you can see, and this is what I really want you to pay attention to, take a look at the torque. I mean, 4-valve Coyote motors are not known for their torque, but they actually should be. I mean, this thing made 474 foot-pounds of torque with a stock intake manifold on it, so it did very well. And obviously it's down quite a bit from the 571 horsepower that it produced with the Boss intake manifold. So comparing a 4.8 to a 5 liter Coyote, even a modified 4.8, probably not a very fair contest. But let's find out what happens when we compare the Coyote to the larger 5.3 liter. So obviously comparing the 5 liter Coyote to the 4.8 liter LS might not be a completely fair comparison for the truck motor. Let's find out how the Coyote compares to the larger 5.3 liter. So we've got a stock 5.3 run in the same manner as we've run the 4.8. We ran it with long tube headers, a Holley HP management system, no accessories, basically all stock truck intake and open throttle body, the way that we normally run it. Now this particular one made 344 horsepower and 379 foot-pounds of torque. It's actually down a little bit from normally what we see from the wrecking yard stuff. Normally they're in the 350 to 355 range, so this one might have been a little bit softer, but you know, sometimes with the wrecking yard, you know, you get what you get. But here's what happened after we modified this thing with, just like with the 4.8 liter. As a matter of fact, we installed the exact same combination, the exact same combination of parts on the 5.3 liter as we did on the 4.8. So we did heads, cam, and intake. We did the fast LSX-RT intake. We did the ported TEA stage 2 706 heads. And we did the same Crane 224 camshaft. And equipped as such, our 5.3 liter, our modified 5.3, produced 484 horsepower and 420 foot-pounds of torque. So those are big gains from a heads, cam, and intake manifold. And you can see most of the gain came past 4,200 RPM. But maybe we were starting out a little bit soft on this thing. I think probably 500 might be a little bit more realistic number if this thing was all sealed up and working well the way that it was. Now, I don't know if this thing was down because of the cylinder heads were leaking or because of the compression or that kind of stuff. But here's what we got. But here's how it compares to the Coyote. Now, this is with the heads cam and the stock intake manifold. And you can see, even then, the Coyote still makes a lot more power and a lot more torque. And then we're talking about 545 horsepower compared to 484. And then even in torque, the Coyote with the variable cam, more compression, good intake manifold, we're talking about 474 versus 424 foot-pounds. So big change. The Coyote made a lot more both horsepower and torque. And remember, we still have on the Coyote, we still have the short runner intake where it made for 571 horsepower way out here. But torque was down, but the peak torque, even with the short runner intake, was above what the 5.3 made. So interesting comparison, but let's find out now. We've tested the 4.8 and the 5.3. Let's find out how well a modified 6-liter does against the 5-liter Coyote. Our final comparison for the 5-liter Coyote was actually a 6-liter, but this particular test motor started out as an LY6 with variable cam timing, but we replaced the variable cam because we could not control it with a stock fixed LQ4 camshaft. So run in this manner. Remember, the LY6 has rectangular port heads like an LS3. It also has a factory truck manifold. This is basically the truck version of a factory LS3 intake manifold, and it makes the same power as an LS3. So we had a fixed cam, we had the rec port heads, we had a 6-liter displacement, and we had a good intake manifold on it. And this test motor was run just as we had run the 4.8 and the 5.3, with long tube headers, a Holley HP management system, an open throttle body, and a Mazir electric water pump. So run in this manner, our stockish 6-liter produced 443 horsepower and offered plenty of torque at 467 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened when we put heads, cam, and intake manifold on this. On this particular application, we installed a set of TrickFlow 225 cathedral port heads and a fast 102 millimeter with 102 millimeter throttle body LSXR intake manifold, and we installed a comp 54-459 cam, which is a 231 degree duration on the intake side, kind of getting near the limit of what we can put in a factory LS with available piston to valve clearance. So run with a good intake manifold, a good camshaft, and good cylinder heads. This combination produced 576 horsepower, and peak torque checked in at 509 foot-pounds of torque. So this 6-liter actually did very well. Here's what happened as we overlay this modified 6-liter combination to our Coyote. So for the first time, the LS actually, they made very comparable power. So 576 versus 571 on the Coyote. And this is the Coyote equipped with the Boss intake manifold. As you can see, the 5-liter made less torque than the 6-liter does. So if you're going to get an LS and want to compete with a 5-liter Coyote, it looks like you might have to step all the way up to a 6-liter, although I did not test a 5.7-liter, and that might be another option and kind of put us obviously between the 6-liter and the 5.3-liter. But it's interesting that a 5-liter Coyote makes almost as much peak power, and that, remember, this is a Gen 1 Coyote, and that a Gen 2 and 3 version obviously make quite a bit more. There are better intake manifolds now for the Coyote, much better than the Boss and better than the factory intake manifold. It's just interesting that this particular combination, a Coyote, makes power so well compared to even bigger displacement motors. Now, the other thing I want to point out is if you take a look at the torque peak of the Coyote, which was 474 foot-pounds with the long runner intake manifold, if you multiply that out, that's 94.8 foot-pounds per liter, which is an impressive amount when you think about it. To put that into perspective, if the 6-liter made that, it would make 569 foot-pounds rather than the 508 or 9 foot-pounds that it actually makes. And that would mean that the 5.3-liter would have to make over 500 foot-pounds, or that the 4.8 would have to make 455 foot-pounds rather than making less than 400 foot-pounds. So it just goes to show you how effective the double overhead cam, variable cam, and they really did a good job in making that Coyote produce not only peak power, which we could expect from a high revving 4-valve motor, but also lots of average power. So it's a good combination. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what's our takeaway from the comparison between our 5-liter Coyote and the 4.8-liter, the 5.3-liter, and the larger 6-liter? First of all, you have to give it up to the Coyote. It's an impressive performer. I mean, we would expect a double overhead cam 4-valve motor to make lots of power out at the top of the RPM range, especially when we can rev that thing with good cams and ported heads and stuff. We would expect that. But the thing that impressed me the most about the Coyote was the specific torque output. I mean, for its displacement, it makes a lot of torque. I mean, it makes a lot more than the 4.8, which we might expect because it has more displacement, but it also makes a lot more than the bigger 5.3-liter. In fact, it took a 6-liter LS to eventually make as much or a little bit more power than the 5-liter Coyote, although the 6-liter made a lot more torque. But also bear in mind, this was a Gen 1 Coyote, and this was done 10 years ago. The modern Coyote stuff, the Gen 2 and Gen 3 stuff, is even more powerful. But the Coyote is not without its problems. First of all, for a lot of applications, it's very wide. Guys complain about maybe fitting it in to a lot of chassis where they would like to be able to put it in. The two other things that I don't like about the Coyote, one is the expense. Now, I can't go down to a local wrecking yard and find a Mustang Coyote engine. I can't find one for a few $100 the way that I can to start out with an LS motor. So right off the bat, as much as I would like to have one and I think that they're cool and they make good power, I just can't go get one from a local wrecking yard and put it up on the dyno or even swap it into another car. The other problem the thing that I don't like about mod motors is I don't like the bore centers that they use, and that just kind of limits displacement. Because for me, the only thing better than a 5-liter Coyote would be a 6-liter Coyote. Because if we could have the ability to make them even bigger with bigger bores and bigger strokes and that kind of stuff, I think there would be more popularity for the Coyote. A 6-liter Coyote would be just awesome. Just imagine the power that it would make. But even the 5-liter stuff makes good power. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I will keep testing.